You are watching the live video. You are watching the video edition of the Special Chronicles Show. This is episode 311 with August John Moe joining us again on the program. If you want to listen or download the audio podcast, you can go to specialchronicles.com/show, specialchronicles.com/show, and all the links will be in the description right below this video. Let's get the...
This is Special Chronicles, giving respect and a voice to people with special needs.
We have 6 children.
And of those 6 children, 4 are deaf, 2 are hearing, and 4 are adopted.
I wish that Joe didn't speak. I would rather he be deaf just like the rest of the family. What do you think?
I want to become deaf.
We had some people say, oh no, your daughter's hearing, but you're signing?
Some people said that it's child abuse.
I had to make some tough decisions where I had to disassociate from some family members.
We're parents first, deaf people second.
Say the word baseball.
I can't hear you.
It doesn't look like he has a nerve on that left side.
Sometimes people scream at me, hello, my name is... Which drives me crazy.
We have stuff just like normal people do. Surprise, surprise.
This is episode 311 of the Special Chronicles Show. This week on Special Chronicles, our guest is again John Moe, executive producer of the new documentary film Deaf Out Loud, is here to talk about his new film premiering on A&E Network on September 12th right now.
Thinking how the world can be so cruel. I lend my voice to those who can't. It's time we try, it's time we care, it's time we stand. It starts with a voice.
Podcasting since 2008, this is the show where we're broadcasting disability stories from an insider's perspective, and we are giving a voice to people with special needs. This is your weekly guide to finding joy, acceptance, and inclusion. Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, and welcome back to the Special Chronicles Show. My name is Daniel. I'm your host and founder of Special Chronicles. So good to be back behind the mic, and I'm so excited that our guest again joining us back on the program is Jonathan Moe. John is the creator and executive producer of the critically acclaimed and Emmy award-winning original docuseries Born This Way. And most recently, John is the executive producer of the new documentary film Deaf Out Loud, which is premiering on the A&E Network this September 12th, a new documentary special that follows the lives of 3 predominantly deaf families who utilize different communication models in everyday life, of which I just had the opportunity to screen this week. And welcome back to Special Chronicles, John.
Thanks. Glad to be here, Daniel.
So, I'm sure a lot of our listeners heard you on the program at the beginning of this year, and if our listeners or viewers missed that conversation, they can go to specialchronicles.com/bone this way to listen or watch that previous conversation that we did on this program. But for any new listeners, why don't you reintroduce yourself to our listeners and tell us about your personal connection to the deaf community?
Sure. Well, I think one of the things I've tried to do in my career, and one of the things our company, Bunim-Murray, has done, is to try and bring to television people who might have been previously marginalized, people who weren't seen on television. So we did that with The Real World with LGBTQ people, and we're doing it with Born This Way with young adults with Down syndrome. That Born This Way premiered its new season this past month. We are now doing it with deaf families. And for me, it's been a fascinating journey. I didn't know a lot about deaf culture. Like a lot of Americans, I just sort of had my own preconceived ideas of what it was like to be deaf in America. And this opportunity to go out and spend time with 3 deaf families and sort of tell their story, and each family is unique, has their own way of navigating the hearing world, has just been very educational and very exciting for me.
Awesome. We'll get into a little bit more of the of this new film, Deaf Out Loud, in just a few moments. But first, with Born This Way, season 4 of your Emmy-winning show airing on A&E just this past month. Can you tell us about some of the new challenges that you have faced with this new season?
Well, the big story this season is that Christina is finally going to marry her longtime boyfriend and fiance, Angel. And it's really interesting because, again, Christina's parents and Angel's grandparents and her mom, they've all done such a great job at helping Christina and Angel become as independent as possible. And I think, they wanted to make sure that Angel and Christina were ready to take this big step. And I think it's pretty clear to everybody who's watching the show that they were. So you have a big wedding, and, that's always interesting because, when Christina goes shopping for a wedding dress, is she going to choose something that just she likes? Is she going to be influenced by her mom? Does mom feel she still needs to help guide Christina, or does she step back and let her make her own decision? There's so many decisions along the way. And I think one of the things we're seeing in the series is that, these parents have done an amazing job of raising these young people and helping them take these steps towards independence. But sometimes it's a little hard for them to sort of step back and let those decisions be made, whether they agree with them or not.
Neat. And I understand that you recently spoke on Capitol Hill on July 30th at Respectability's Summit from Washington to Hollywood and Beyond, and the future of Americans with disabilities. Can you briefly recap about what you spoke about during this conference on July 30th?
Yeah, I was fortunate enough to moderate a wonderful panel that featured 3 other efforts to increase awareness and to bring more diversity, including people with disabilities. There was a woman on the panel, Janine Betancourt, who is involved with bringing the first autistic character to Sesame Street. And also there was Andrew Solomon and the documentary director who has made his book into a wonderful new documentary about 5 families with children who have various disabilities. And then there was Crystal Emery, who's a filmmaker, who also happens to have a disability. She's a paraplegic. And so it was a wonderful discussion. My contribution was, besides moderating the panel, I talked about Deaf Out Loud and about this deep dive into deaf culture and the challenge for deaf families of raising their children in a hearing world.
Neat. Well, speaking of your new film, Deaf Out Loud, you talk a little bit about, and once again, our guest today on the program is John Murray, the executive producer of the new documentary film Deaf Out Loud, premiering on A&E on September 12th. And can you take us back to when this project began and kind of the backstory on how you first started with this?
Sure. In Los Angeles, there's a theater called Deaf Theater West, and they had a production of Spring Awakening where a number of the actors in the production were deaf. And I had an opportunity to meet some of them, and it started to make me think about, well, maybe there's another group of people whose story hasn't really been told. We brought in Marlee Maitland, one of famous actress who happens to be deaf, who won an Oscar for Children of a Lesser God. And with her, we put together this series, or this special, Deaf Out Loud. And the idea was to look at 3 different families who were predominantly deaf, and take a look at how they help their children navigate the hearing world. Would they use American Sign Language? Would they try to seek out some of the new technology like cochlear implants? Do they prefer a deaf school to a hearing school? More mainstream education versus specialized education. There's just lots of things to look at in terms of, the choices a lot of us who don't happen to be deaf don't think about. And so it was interesting to sort of look at these families and look at the challenges they face. In our 1 hour doc special, one of the families, their son is having trouble in the mainstream school because it's hard because, he has to watch the teacher write stuff on the blackboard, but he also has to watch the sign language interpreter. And so his eyes almost have to be in 2 places at once, and that's hard to do and learn that way. So if he goes to a deaf school, then he'll actually have a teacher who's using sign language, and he won't have to look in 2 directions. So those are some of the kinds of stories that and some of the challenges that these families deal with that we wanted to tell those stories.
Neat. Awesome. Well, why did you want to produce this film and telling these stories about these 3 deaf families?
Well, yeah, first of all, I fell in love with the families. They're all so wonderful. They each have amazing sense of humor, and they're just so distinct and interesting. And I just felt like it would be, I learned so much. Our crew, camera people, and the whole team learned so much shooting this that we thought that, everybody in America would enjoy it. Plus, within the deaf community itself, there's a lot of sometimes disagreement over the best way to raise your children in a hearing world. Whether you should embrace the new technologies or whether you should focus on American Sign Language. The whole question of, God made me deaf, so maybe I should stay deaf. It's like, why should I change who I am? That's a real part of who I am and how I live my life. That's part of my culture. So there's lots of interesting questions to look at. So I think that families, people who are deaf will find this show interesting, but I think also those of us who are not deaf will also find it interesting.
Yeah, awesome. Yeah, and in just this week in screening your film, I found a lot of those same things when I screened your film, and I love the sense of humor from the various deaf families and everything. With having learning disabilities, I've had some ASL in my younger years, so I know a little bit of ASL. But even with not being deaf, it was still fascinating to kind of learn about the deaf culture that you showed through the film.
Great, I'm glad you enjoyed it.
Yeah. So you talked about these three deaf families. Can you talk a little bit about the casting and how you found these three families? So I believe one was in Texas, one was in Connecticut, and I'm blanking on where the third.
Yeah, the third was also in Texas. It's interesting. There are in America probably at least 6 or 7 parts of the country where there are a lot of people who are deaf. And this, I think, comes from the fact that there are these schools, there are these universities, and there are these great schools which are particularly designed for and are very inclusive when it comes to people who are deaf. So, in Austin, Texas, there's the Texas School for the Deaf. And in Connecticut, there's another school for the deaf. So we looked, in casting the show, we looked at those 6, 7, 8 areas where there were large communities of people who were deaf. And so we focused on those, and we put the word out, and we started to meet different families, and ultimately made our choice of these 3 families. And part of our choice for these 3 families was they're each sort of different in how they're raising their children in a hearing world. And what's interesting is that most deaf children are born to people who are hearing, because more people are hearing than are deaf. But in some of our deaf families, there's one family that has both a hearing child and a non-hearing child, a deaf child. So it's really interesting how these families blend all this. It's not that, it's not automatic that everybody in the family is going to be deaf. There's a mixture of people in terms of how deaf they are or how much hearing they have.
Neat. And you have talked about how a lot of these deaf schools are all inclusive. Do you find it in getting to know these 3 families that it's important to be inclusive just within the deaf schools, or inclusive in the hearing schools / mainstream schools to have deaf students?
Yeah, I think it's interesting. I think it's very important that if a child wants to go to a mainstream school, that there be the kinds of services provided so that child can be successful in that mainstream school. And it's interesting, most schools for the deaf, primarily people who are deaf attend them. But it's interesting because I think there was an after-school program where one of our families was saying, well, I'd like my hearing child to attend this after-school program, even though it's a program that's run and at a school for the deaf. So it's interesting how, I think we're all better for it when we can mix things up.
Yeah, absolutely.
One of the things as a production that we faced when we told this story was, some of the people in it who are deaf speak, maybe because they, weren't initially completely deaf, so they learned to speak. They could hear enough that they could learn to speak, or maybe they learned to speak even though they were deaf. And as producers, as people who are hearing, it's when you're editing and when you're looking at it, it's very easy sort of to use your hearing privilege and want to use the people who speak because it's just easier. So we had to be very conscious of the fact that we gave, that we gave equal time to those people who just used American Sign Language. And then we also had to figure out, do we use, for the hearing audience, do we use subtitles? Do we use interpreters? So in the story, the way we ended up doing it was in some of it, you'll see someone using American Sign Language, and you will just have subtitles.
Yeah.
And then when we did the interviews, that's in a lot of the scene work. For instance, there's a discussion between April and Paco Garcia, one of our families, and they're talking about their son who hasn't been using his hearing aids and not taking him to school. And so they're having this discussion, and so that just plays with the American Sign Language, and you see the subtitles. Whereas when we cut to an interview, you actually hear an interpreter's voice as Paco, who is deaf, is talking. So there were a lot of interesting sort of questions we had to answer and figure out for the style of the show, how we were convey the story.
Neat. I found it really interesting how you were able to kind of go back and forth between the various different stories. And once again, our guest today on the Special Chronicles program is John Murray, the executive producer of the new documentary Deaf Out Loud, premiering on the A&E network this September 12th. And can you comment on and talk a little bit about some of the lessons that you learned while filming?
Well, yeah, I mean, it was really interesting. When we went into this, we had some ideas of how we were going to do it, and sometimes those ideas didn't quite work out. We thought that, it was interesting because when we were at someone's home who is deaf, and most of the interaction going on is deaf, we had an interpreter who was translating for us what the person was saying in American Sign Language, and what they were saying would go into our ears so that we could simultaneously hear that. But because we didn't, and they had to be a little far back because we didn't want necessarily to have their audio, their sound to bleed into the soundtrack. So there were a lot of technical things that we had to figure out how we were going to, as hearing people, how we were going to be able to cover this story. And then we always felt it was important that when we started editing the special, we edited, when we had the edit done for each family, we actually sent them that segment so they could look at it to make sure that the subtitles and the interpreter got everything said exactly the way they wanted it said. We wanted to make sure that, we didn't mischaracterize what they were saying. It was important that what they were saying come out correctly.
Neat. And can you tell us about the timeline of when did you first cast these three families, and then when you started to film?
Yeah. Boy, it's been a while. I think we cast them a ways back. I mean, I think it was we cast them at the beginning of probably the beginning of 2017, and we shot it in 2017. And then we took a while to edit it. So it was a fairly, it was a long process. And then we knew we wanted to have plenty of time before it aired to, get the word out to various organizations and through social media and through people like you with the Special Chronicles. So it's been, I guess we've probably been in these families' lives for almost 2 years, and here finally the special is going to air on A&E. And I tell you, the families are so excited. It's amazing. They've been sharing the trailer that we have, and I think it's already been seen by almost 1 million people.
Wow, awesome. And can you remind us again how you found these three deaf families?
Yeah, we went to these parts of the country that had large deaf populations, mainly because, Gallaudet University is in Washington, D.C., and because it's a deaf university, there's a lot of people who are deaf in that area. So we looked there. We looked in Connecticut because there's another school for the deaf there. So we focused our casting on these parts of the country where we knew there were lots of people who were deaf.
Awesome. Oh, and our guest today on the Special Chronicles program is John Murray, the executive producer of Deaf Out Loud, a new documentary premiering on the A&E network this September 12th. Can you tell us about some of the that we see throughout this 1 hour special? Some of the misconceptions that exist for deaf individuals, from schooling to employment and raising a family.
Sure. Well, the family that's in Connecticut, the dad, Mick, this is a guy with, he has a bachelor's and a master's degree. And, he says a lot of people assume because he is deaf that somehow he's not educated. I think there's a lot of misconception about deaf people. So here's this super bright guy with these 2 college degrees. He's a teacher, and sometimes people talk to him like he's uneducated, which is very frustrating for him. His wife, Rachel, a lot of times she has to go into situations with her work where she's in a room full of hearing people. And, that makes her very nervous sometimes that she's going to be able to successfully communicate to them. So there's just lots of interesting things. Their daughter, Faith, says it drives her crazy when people talk super loud to her and very slowly. It's like, hello, Faith, and she goes, what do they think, I'm stupid? And plus, if you know anything for people, if someone's reading your lips, you just need to speak normally, but face them. You don't exaggerate it. So there's both serious things and silly things that, face these families as they go through their daily lives.
Neat. And can you talk a little bit about the deaf families? How through the film, a few of them have mentioned about not being disabled. Can you comment on this as it relates to the advocacy work of respectability and also the advocacy work here at Special Chronicles when it comes to all different types of disabilities, including the deaf community? But then I found it really interesting that a few of these deaf individuals talked about not being disabled.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think this goes back to, I was born deaf. This is the way I am meant to be. I can be successful as a deaf person using American Sign Language or whatever other way I communicate. And, I think that to some extent, they don't see themselves as disabled. Some of the people in our project. That doesn't mean they don't think there should be accommodations for people who are deaf. It doesn't mean that they don't think that when they go to see a play, there shouldn't be someone doing American Sign Language. But I think it's more a fact of they want to say that this is the way they're born. I'm proud of who I am. I don't see myself as a person who is disabled. I see myself as someone who is, pretty much like anybody else. I just happen to have a different way of communicating.
Neat. But
that is something I thought about, because we do so much. All of us have been working so hard to advocate for people with disabilities, and it's interesting when you have someone who says, "Well, I actually don't consider myself disabled." Yeah. So it's sort of fascinating.
Yeah. I found that lady fascinated as well, with advocating for all of us with disabilities, but then you have certain people, and I'm sure that the deaf community is not the only community out there who might not find themselves disabled. I'm sure that there might even be some people with autism or other disabilities who might not consider themselves with having a disability.
Right. Yeah. No. I mean, I think I think all of us want to be accepted for who we are, but sometimes, if we, are in a wheelchair, we need places of work, we need stores, we need airports, we need them to be accessible to us. We need to be able to roll our wheelchair right where anybody else goes. So, I think in many ways, hopefully we're working towards a day when everybody, however they happen to be born or whatever's happened to them, they're able to fully participate in work and in the community and in entertainment and life. I think that's what we all want, is we want everybody to be able to participate, and we don't want to leave anybody behind.
Yeah, absolutely. And one of our guests today on the Special Chronicles program is John Murray, the executive producer of the new documentary Deaf Out Loud, premiering on September 12th on the A&E network. What do you hope that the viewers will gain from watching this film, and not just viewers within the deaf community, but also in the mainstream community, and kind of when they watch this, when it premieres on September 12th on A&E, and then when they go out into their jobs, go out into their communities, what do you hope?
Sure. Well, for the general population, I hope they will take from this that people who are deaf are smart, they're educated, and they want to fully participate. They want to compete for the same jobs. They want to be able to send their kids to the school of their choice. And that, I think all of us have to support them in that. And for people who are part of the deaf community, I think it's an opportunity to sort of let them look into the lives of other deaf people who may not live their lives exactly the same way as they do, and to see what they think, whether they embrace technologies like cochlear implants or whether they feel they don't need them, whether they just whether they choose to go to mainstream school or whether they choose to go to a school for the deaf. So I think if you're someone part of the deaf community, I think it's fascinating to look at other people like you and see how they live their lives.
Yeah, awesome. And speaking of the controversial topic of cochlear implants that you show and discuss in this film, what have you learned about this as it relates to families that as it relates to these three families that you showed in this film, Deaf Out Loud?
Yeah, it's first of all, not everyone who is deaf will benefit from a cochlear implant. There's a lot of science to it, and you have to have a nerve there, and then the other thing is, for a lot of people, having a cochlear implant doesn't mean that you necessarily hear the way I might hear. So it's not this like perfect thing where suddenly you just turn it on and suddenly you have this perfect hearing. It's a little different than that, and it's much more nuanced than that. And you know, Mick Posner in our film, he had a cochlear implant, but he chooses not to use it. He just found that it did not really help him that much. So so it's interesting. I've met other people, not necessarily who were in this film, who became deaf later in life, who had you know, some kind of an illness that ultimately resulted in them losing their hearing. And within 6 weeks of losing their hearing, they got cochlear implants, and apparently they benefited greatly by having a cochlear implant. And they were someone who was, you know, who grew up hearing. So I think for them, there was a desire to get their hearing back if they could. You know, whereas someone who maybe grew up deaf says, what hearing loss? I'm fine the way I am. So I guess I learned that, you know, there are no easy answers when it comes to cochlear implants. But you know, it's not necessarily the perfect solution for everybody.
Neat. And so the deaf young adults that you feature, I'm blinking on their names, but they both have hearing parents, and they're raising one deaf child and a hearing child. What have you learned from this family?
Yeah, that's the Mansfield family in Austin, and their daughters are Ivy and Shay, and Shay is deaf and Ivy is hearing. And it's really interesting because they as a family felt, when they had their second daughter, Ivy, who was hearing, they felt it was very important that she learn American Sign Language. And their primary language in the house is American Sign Language, because when Ivy and Shay grow up, they want to make sure that these girls have a common language. And the only common language they can really have is American Sign Language. And so they've, you know, some people have been sort of surprised or shocked that they, you know, want their hearing daughter to use American Sign Language. But when you think about it, it's really a smart decision of theirs, because they want those two girls to have that great relationship. And the only way they can do it is if they both speak the same language. And the only language they're both capable of doing, is American Sign Language. So so they're learning that, and it was really interesting, and to sort of see and understand why they made that choice.
Yeah. I found that really interesting as well, to see kind of how they.
Yeah, and part of that choice was because the dad, Manny, he and his brother are not close, and part of the fact that they're not close, he thinks, is because his brother never really learned American Sign Language, so they don't have that common language.
Do you think that this film, Deaf Out Loud, when it premieres on September 12th on A&E, that some of the families like Manny's family with his brother, and when they see this film, do you think it will change their perspective and their relationships?
You know, I don't know. I certainly, you know, those relationships are very personal, and they've happened over lots of years. And so it'll be interesting to see. I guess I'm not sure what will happen, but I'll be interested to hear from Manny what his family's reaction to the special was.
Neat. And so the family who gets their deaf child into a deaf school, can you comment on this issue or topic? We mentioned a little bit earlier in the program about deaf schools and mainstream schools, but can you maybe comment a little bit on deaf schools versus inclusive versus inclusion in the hearing or mainstream schools?
Sure. Zaid, the young man who is Paco and April's son, he was going to a mainstream school, and as I mentioned, he was having trouble sort of following what was going along, because he had to look at both the interpreter and at the blackboard and the teacher. And also, I think his hearing aids weren't always working that well for him. So he was leaving them at home sometimes. And Palco and April just want their son to do well. He's a bright young man, and they just want to make sure that he can succeed wherever he is. So Paco had gone to the Texas School for the Deaf, and so they decided that, well, maybe they should take Zaid over there to see what he would think, whether he would be comfortable there. And so it's really fascinating. It's really fun to watch him go there and suddenly be surrounded by all these other children who are also using sign language. I mean, you just see this big smile, this big grin on his face to be surrounded with so many other kids who speak his language.
Neat. And can you tell us a little bit about the title of this film, Deaf Out Loud? How did you come up with the title?
Titles are always tough. When we were coming up with Born This Way, we went through probably 300 titles. And with Deaf Out Loud, you want a title that sounds fun. And you want something that people will go, oh, that sounds interesting. And so the idea of Deaf Out Loud, part of it is that people think because someone's deaf, they're quiet. And if ever you've been around deaf people, that's not true. Deaf people can be very loud. And so we sort of like this idea of Deaf Out Loud. It was in a way of saying deaf people want to be heard. They're not silent. They have something to say. So I think that's how we came up with Deaf Out Loud.
Neat. And similarly to how Respectability produced a resource guide for Born This Way of a number of different resources, do you know if your production company or Respectability or any other organization is planning any type of resource guide for Deaf Out Loud?
Yes, A&E, Kim Gilmore there, has created, with the help of Respectability and some others, and with the help of our families, a wonderful educational guide to the series. And I encourage teachers to get that guide from A&E. I know they're making it available to schools and to various organizations. It's a great guide and has some really wonderful information, some great resources, as well as some really interesting questions that teachers could use to discuss the whole area of deaf culture with students.
Neat. And how can our listeners get a copy of this guide? Or?
Well, I think if you go to ane.com, to the A&E network, and look up Deaf Out Loud, my guess is that it will have it, but certainly between now and when the Special Chronicles airs, I will make sure that it's available there.
Okay, awesome. Yeah, because we're planning on airing this on September 9th, so the week that your film airs, to kind of tie in with when your film is airing on A&E. Once again, our guest today on the Special Chronicles program, our guest is John Murray, the executive producer of Deaf Out Loud, a new film premiering on A&E this September 12th. That we hope all of you listening will go and definitely check out. Can you share with us any social media plugs and website plugs for your production company and for this new Deaf Out Loud film, and how our listeners can watch this film, as well as if the film will be available anywhere else on streaming or on demand for those of our listeners who may not have.
Sure. Well, we're already starting to put some material out. People can watch the trailer for Deaf Out Loud at ane.com, and we're going to have some little bio packages on our three families. They'll also one of the executive producers on Deaf Out Loud is Marley Maitland, and she has done a special interview with us about Deaf Out Loud and about her life. And so we're going to be releasing that on ane.com and in social media. But yeah, it will air first on A&E, and then it will be available on demand on A&E. And yeah, so that's where it'll be available first, and then we'll see where it'll be released after that.
Awesome. And it's once again it will be airing on A&E on Wednesday, September 12th at
8, 7 Central.
8, 7 Central. Awesome. And so I'll put all those links and information in the show notes on specialchronicles.com for this episode 311, as well as I'll make sure to share the trailer as well as the video with Marley Mountain and your other resources on the social media for Special Chronicles to share with us.
Great, thank you.
When this podcast airs.
Right.
And so, do you have any final thoughts on your overall time here today on Special Chronicles?
No. It was really a pleasure talking with you about both Born This Way, which is airing, right now on A&E, and about Deaf Out Loud. It's great that you have this program, which allows us to spread the word to a lot of people.
Yeah, absolutely. I want to remind all listeners that you can email us feedback anytime, feedback@specialchronicles.com. Or new this month, we just launched where you can now text us your feedback instantly anytime in anywhere that you are listening to this program. You can type in feedback@specialchronicles.com in your text messaging app, where you normally put someone's phone number, but put in that address, feedback@specialchronicles.com, and it will show up it'll show up instantly on this iPad that I have in studio. And you can also share your feedback on social media at Special Chronicles on Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube, and at Special C Podcast on Twitter. And make sure to leave us your 5-star ratings and reviews on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Google Play, Facebook, and wherever you listen to your podcasts. And once again, Special Chronicles is proud to partner with the ComEd Energy Force Ambassador Program. The Energy Force is the country's first energy efficiency education program designed for and taught by people with disabilities. ComEd is really powering lives and is really powering Special Chronicles to make programs like what you hold today with John Murray possible. You can learn more at specialchronicles.com/ComEd, at specialchronicles.com/ComEd, and we thank ComEd for the journalist support of Special Chronicles. And this episode 311 is brought to you by listeners like you. Please join our supporters and help support us at Special Chronicles with your tax-deductible donation today to help us continue our mission of giving respect and voice to people with special needs. Please go to specialchronicles.com/given, at specialchronicles.com/given, and we thank you for your generous support of our mission at Special Chronicles. And that is a mouthful, but I had to get that sponsor information mentioned at the end of the program. Once again, our guest today has been John Murray, the executive producer of the new documentary Deaf Out Loud, premiering once again on A&E this Wednesday, September 12th at 8 to 7 Central. Hopefully you all will tune in. And it's been a joy having you back on the show, John.
Great. Thanks, Daniel. It was fun.
And hopefully we can meet up in person someday. And until next week, take care, and we remember, choose to include.
Great, thanks.
Chronicles, giving respect and a voice to people with special needs.
Stop the audio and go ahead and stop